Welcome to the Mockingcast, the podcast of Mockingbird Ministries. I'm David Zoll, your host, and in just a few moments, I'll be joined by my co-hosts, Sarah Condon and RJ Heijmen. We come to you every other Friday to explore a few of the places where we currently see grace and its absence playing out in unexpected and compelling ways. We're glad to have you with us.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. God.
Okay, middle of February, here we go. Before we jump in, I wanted to make two quick announcements. We've started something called the Mockingbird Digest, which is a bi-weekly email update that we're going to sort of tailor-made that incorporates all the various things that Mockingbird's doing, sort of recent posts, recent podcasts, announcements about stuff, things from the archives. You know, that we're kind of jumping on, I guess, the e-newsletter bandwagon, but if you want to sign up, you can do that at ember.com. Should be fairly easy. First one's already gone out, and we've gotten great response to it. The other thing is that we are really, 6 weeks away from the beginning of our conference season, and that is two different conferences, one in Tyler, Texas, the 2nd through the 4th of April, and we're calling it the Mockingbird Festival this year. If you're anywhere near Tyler, Texas, come on down. It's going to be fantastic. Will Willimon is speaking, Carrie Willard, Jason Micheli will be there. I'll be there. Jacob Smith will be there. Just going to be a fantastic time. But then the main event, as we know, is in New York, and we'll be recording a live episode of this there in some form or another, and that's going to be that's April 23rd through the 25th in New York City. And those who listened to the last episode know that Tom Holland is no joke when it comes to both what he has to say and how he's going to say it. Tara Isabella Burton is speaking. She's just absolutely murdering it on her pieces these days. And then, just a whole cast of characters from Mockingbird. I'm very excited to hear from my younger brother, Simeon, but, there'll be a same old song recording. It's going to be a fantastic party. There's even a special film event that's happening that I'm not even allowed to really talk about. So just put that under your cap. Okay, announcements over.
My cap is on and it's put under.
Florida man, RJ Heijmen.
Here I am.
What do you have to say?
Just another day in paradise, Dave. What are you going to do?
Basking in the rays?
Yeah, I've had a great week. I was back in Houston last week for a couple days because I'm just seeing family and being with my boys. Drove back to Houston in a single day with my son Jackson, 16 hours, 1,150 miles. So that was an experience coming back. And
whoa.
It's just been great. I continue to bump into people that I know from other eras, stages, seasons of my life. Like that's happened 3 times this week. And so it just feels like we are where we're supposed to be. And we're thankful to be here. So yeah.
That's great.
Sarah. What's up, Sarah? SC.
Dave, is murdering it like a more PC way of saying killing it? I was like, did he just say murdering it? It's like the dad version. Like he just heard people are saying killing it. He's like, you know what? Let's make it more sophisticated.
Well, you're
Let's
right.
make it more intentional, more premeditated.
It came out of my mouth, and even while it was coming out of my mouth,
Slaughtering it.
That's
You're
not
like,
quite right.
Sarah's gonna make fun of me.
He didn't say crushing it because he's not in finance.
Crushing it.
Oh, I
But,
can't-
Every
I
time
can't
people say
handle that
crushing
term.
it, I just think of Jesus's body on the cross. Like it's like what's the image? Just is very deeply Catholic comes right into my head. I'm like, can you stop saying that? We're good. Ash Wednesday's next week, which is kind of crazy, and so we'll be doing that. I'll be doing that on a college campus for the first time, which is kind of exciting. Yeah, so we're good.
Well, we've got a lot to talk about today. I think we're going to begin here with an article that hits pretty close to the bone. Maybe not for you, but definitely for me. It's by Kate Murphy, who just released a book of the same name. The title of the article is "You're Not Listening. Here's Why." This was in the New York Times. You're not listening. Let me finish. That's not what I said. After I love you, these are among the most common refrains in close relationships. During my 2 years researching a book on listening, I learned something incredibly ironic about interpersonal communication. The closer we feel towards someone, the less likely we are to listen carefully to them. It's called the closeness-communication bias, and over time it can strain and even end relationships. She goes on to explain, once you know people well enough to feel close, there's an unconscious tendency to tune them out because you think you already know what they're going to say. It's kind of like when you've traveled a certain route several times and you no longer notice signposts and scenery. But people are always changing. The sum of daily interactions and activities continually shapes us. So none of us are the same as we were last month, last week, or even yesterday. The closeness communication bias is at work when romantic partners feel they don't know each other anymore, or when parents discover their children are up to things they never imagined. We all develop stereotypes of the people we know well, and those stereotypes lead us to make mistakes. And they give the example of a man getting his wife a really awful present for her birthday. The closeness communication bias not only keeps us from listening to those we love, it can also keep us from allowing our loved ones to listen to us. It may explain why people in close relationships sometimes withhold information or keep secrets from one another. Harvard sociologist Mario Louise Small found that slightly more than half the time, people confided their most pressing and worrisome concerns to people with whom they had weaker ties, even people they encountered by chance, rather than to those they had previously said were closest to them. Needless to say, a lack of listening is a primary contributor to feelings of loneliness. And we've talked before about the widespread feelings of loneliness, and that's going to be a bit of a theme, in fact, this week. But listening well, not listening. You guys listen to me so well every week, every time we record this. I've never said it to you, but has someone ever accused you of not listening well?
Yeah, all the time. I mean yes. Yeah. I read something recently that was like, you shouldn't be planning what you're going to say while the other person's talking. And I was like, wait, so what do I do? It's a real challenge. There's a book that your mom has recommended, a woman who talks about listening.
Anne Long.
Yeah. And so this is the third time you've told me her name, and there's something in me that was reluctant to write it down and order the book, but I know I need to.
You're not listening, Sarah.
When I was reading this, I was thinking about my first spiritual director in Atlanta and how, I guess she'd been married. It seemed like forever. It was probably 25 years. You know what I mean? I was like, oh my God, that's so long. And I asked her, how have you been married to the same person for that long? I guess because Josh and I were engaged, I asked her that. She was like, oh, I haven't been married to the same person. I've been married to 15 different people. You know, your spouse is going to change, and what is that going to look like, and what is that going to mean? So I actually thought about that in this piece, because while I think, she very generously names all these different relationships in which this happens, I think this happens a lot in marriage. It also happens with our children, where we can kind of say, which feeds into what we're going to talk about later, but we can really feed into I have the kind of kid who is like this, which means they're going to say this, and they're going to be worried about this. And so there's really not any point in me listening to them, right?
Mm-hmm. It's funny, Dave, that you said that we listen so well to you when we do the podcast, because I often do, not always, but I listen to the podcast when it comes out. And I'm always struck because you guys said so much stuff that I didn't actually hear because I was thinking so hard about what I was going to say. It's like, oh my gosh, I wish I'd heard them say that the first time. But this article just rang so many of my bells, and so much I could say. I'll say a few things, hopefully not too much. First thing is I speak quickly. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the reasons I speak quickly is because, and I can say this now because he's passed away, I never felt like my father listened to me. He always assumed he knew what I was going to say, and he finished my sentences. And so it's like when I spoke with him, especially when I was trying to communicate something important to him, it was like I have to say this quickly enough so that he won't correct my sentences with what he thinks I'm going to say in an incorrect way, thereby making it painfully clear that he actually has no idea who I am. Mm-hmm. And so I've experienced that. And then also, In our marriage, absolutely 100%. That it is hard to listen to each other, but I think there's more of a reason than just assuming you know the person. I think when you're very close to somebody, it is hard to listen to them, especially when they're going through something difficult or negative, because you're always thinking about, how is this going to affect me? How is this going to affect me? Or if they're talking about someone that's hurt them, then you get angry at the person who has hurt your spouse. And so it's difficult to be an empathetic, but sort of also dispassionate listener in the context of marriage, because again, you're thinking about how what your spouse is going through negatively might affect you. And let's also face it, a lot of the negative emotions you have in a marriage are towards your spouse. And it's difficult to listen to them when they are expressing hurt or pain that may be as a result of something that you've done. But the third thing, because I feel like I had a bit of a breakthrough with this recently as the result of some marriage therapy and listening to Esther Perel's Where Shall We Begin?
So good.
And then also thinking about Ephesians 5, where Paul talks about, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ.
Also good.
Also good. Some people have a tough time with that, that portion of Paul's writing. But I remember thinking how the act of listening, really listening, is an act of submission. Because what you're doing is you are submitting to another person's understanding of the world. And you are, for just a moment, setting aside your own perspective, your own needs, desires, wants, fears, whatever, and you're trying to walk a mile in their shoes. And if you can do that, if you can submit to someone else's understanding of things, even if it's their understanding of you, that just automatically is so healing, so unbelievably healing, to feel heard, to feel felt, to feel, and not just heard, but actually felt, to feel like another person really feels your pain. And I found that to be incredibly healing and helpful in the context of marriage and other loving relationships. So anyway, those are my thoughts.
I always think about, we do premarital counseling here at our church. One of the things we talk about is the mythologies that you bring into a relationship, of your family's like this and my family's like that, and you're the quiet one and I'm the active one, or I'm the one who's good with money and you're the one who's good with, social life, right? Whatever it is, these kind of types, as we're about to talk about, but it's a mythology, and even if it's true 99% of the time, it's still definitely not true 1% of the time. And it's that people in love relationships, and this is very much true with kids too, when you start to write the script for one another, when you kind of you complete their sentences, but really you've already written their script. And I think it's kind of tough for, I fancy myself a writer, and so that kind of casting is going on in my brain, or it can be hard to shut off. But I know that when I stop listening, it's because I think I know what my wife is going to say, and I don't want to hear it, or I feel like I have heard it before, and there's a risk involved in just the submission, I guess you could say, RJ, and something dangerous about allowing whatever it is that is going to be said to be said. But I find that any time where you're writing the script for someone, it's usually some form of judgment, even if it's wrapped up in our love for them, that comes across as silencing and uncaring. The other thing I'll say is that I've got a child who struggles with halting speech. And he's got a lot to say, but he can't quite get it out, or get it out as fast as his contemporaries, shall we say. And it impacts a lot of his life. And I don't think we didn't really realize this. We thought it was other stuff going on, but it was really a speech issue. And that he couldn't actually get the words out. That processing, those synapses weren't quite firing as quickly, and it's very frustrating for him. And it made him angry at teachers, and it made him angry at other kids, and impacted his social life. But then my wife and I, we would wanted to get the show on the road sometimes when he was trying to tell a story or something like that, and then you start to fill in the blanks for him, and it just absolutely enraged him. It always made it worse.
I'm sure.
And so the process of loving this kid is, even when it's a terrible story told in a very roundabout way, is to sit there and die to oneself and whatever that that's what grace is, I guess. You're dying to your agenda for that particular 5 minutes and listening to some story as it comes out very slowly. But I think that when we figured out it was a speech issue and a listening, and therefore a listening issue, and not feeling listened to, that was driving the other behavior, that was the key that unlocked compassion and actually a little bit of forward momentum for this child.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with children I was thinking about when I was reading this was that, like, we are moving so quickly in 2020 that we almost lose the space to be surprised by our children, right? Because we're just like into one activity, into the next activity. Yesterday, my daughter had to get her cheerleader photos taken at school. And so I had sent her in the morning in with her cheer bag, and not to call anybody out, but her dad left it in the back of his car. And so when I came to take her right in to get the pictures, of course, and I'm late, and I've got my other kid with me, and we've not been pleasant to each other. And I walk in, and I have to find her. I have to get the bag. So I'm like, I'm super, like, just not happy with anybody. Which is awkward when you're the priest's wife, right?
Right.
Because, like, I'm walking through the building, everyone's like, hey, Sarah, and I'm just, like, silently putting up a wave hand and glaring straight ahead, like, and everyone's like, is she telling me to stop talking, or is it, So anyway, I'm sitting there, and he's, it's a huge, that thing as a parent, I'm sure you guys do this, where, like, you finally make it to the basketball game, or you finally make it to wherever you are, and you're, like, in an uncomfortable chair staring at your kid. And I was watching the other little girls go, and they were so, like, they posed, and they looked kind of awkward and funny and sweet, like 5-year-old girls who, were, like, trying to be teenagers, but not really getting it. And then my daughter went up, and she put one hand on one hip and popped the other hip out to the side. And her cheer coach, like, turned and looked at me, and she's like, who taught her how to do that? I mean, it was like, and it's not that anyone taught her, it's that it is intrinsic to who Annie Condon is. And, like, no amount of feminism is going to wear it out of her. You know what I mean? But, like, it was such a beautiful moment where I was like, who is this kid going to be, though? You know what I mean? Like, totally surprised by her. And I think that's when I read this, what I think about is that we don't have the space to be surprised by each other anymore, because we're moving so quickly, and we're just like, I know that, or we're in this space. And I think this is very true in marriage, and this is a very broad generalization, but in marriage, it's all about, RJ, you totally nailed this. It's all about our welfare, right? So for men, when your wife comes home and she's really upset about something, you just want to fix it because, and this is a broad generalization, I don't need your emails, people, but the emotional...
I wonder what you're going to say, Sarah.
The emotional welfare of your house feels like it's up for grabs, right? Like, if mom ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. Like, there's a certain amount of, like, men just want to fix this because, like, they just want the emotional welfare of the house to be okay. Whereas when men come home, and they often come home with something about work, and they'll be like, oh, whatever, complain about work, there's an intrinsic, ancient, maybe even not even necessary in the, financial breakdown of your household, but thing in women where it's our physical welfare that kind of, we're like, no, like, you can't have any problems. We don't need to hear about this. Like, just shut it down. I don't want to hear this. You know what I mean? I don't want to hear this tape. And so I think there's a point in marriage at which we kind of have to name that, so that we're not shutting each other up because we're super anxious, and that maybe we'll be surprised by each other. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's totally true. That fear is the most primal human emotion, right?
Mm-hmm.
That everything is geared towards the preservation of self and the preservation of family, and anything which could be construed to threaten that is automatically, is terrifying. And you just want to shut it down. You don't want to listen. You want to fix. And which are all so destructive to genuine listening. And I'll say, Sarah, you kind of said this. It's not just kids that are fascinating. It's adults too, and when I've
Yeah.
listened to people who are really good listeners, I think about Ira Glass on this, sometimes the interviews he does and the things he gets people to say on This American Life, because he is curious.
Yeah.
And that was another big word, in moments when my wife and I were doing therapy, is like, can you be curious
Yes.
about what the other is experiencing, and
Yeah.
not just someone you're ministering to, but actually someone you're living with,
Right.
and
It's
not
easier to
assume-
be curious about someone you're ministering
It is, because it's also not threatening. It's not
right.
threatening.
Because it's not going to affect you either
it's not
way.
going to really
yeah.
affect you. Exactly.
Yeah.
But can you get past sort of the fear and the pain and get curious to the root of what's actually going on, which then, of course, builds intimacy.
Right.
And gets you what you want, sort of strengthens your bond even in the midst of turbulent times.
Mhm.
And that's what you really want, is someone who loves you and to be loved and to be known, even when things are difficult. Because, like newsflash, life doesn't stop getting difficult
Right.
or scary, but having someone to share it with makes it a little bit easier.
That's very, I think that's totally true. And it's very convicting. I mean, it's amazing to think that God listens this way. I remember today we just put up a thing. I just put up a meme on our Instagram account from my father from his book, Grace in Practice. And it's sort of one of those great sections of that book. He says, prayer is not the expression of an idea. It is not the embodiment in speech of the position of absolute dependence that is assumed within the theology of grace. Prayer is the expression of a relationship. That is easy to say and sounds a little trite, but prayer is one word: help. That is what prayer is. It is the cry for aid in the circumstance where there is no aid and no resources to provide aid. I think that's...
It's so funny to hear you say this, though, because the other thing, the Zalls are both getting a shout out this episode, obviously, but the other thing I keep thinking about is your dad. And when I've called him for advice in ministry, one thing, so I'll say whatever it is I'm dealing with, and then he'll say, is there something else that you need from me? Is there some other way I can help you? And no one's ever asked me that before. And I'm like, I mean, how much time do you have? But it's like, I don't even have to have a yes to that. But the fact that I get asked in such an earnest way makes me feel heard. I don't know.
Well, he definitely has that effect, and so does my mother's.
Yeah.
I grew up with that almost sometimes as a child of that. You get a little too cognizant of when you're being actively listened to, and you want to say, what are you thinking right now? What tape is actually playing in your brain? And yet, I'd still prefer that over the opposite. And you do think about this in terms of ministry and relationships, and I think about it, when people talk about their relationships with church and with God, they often give you, if they're really angry, and then they sometimes or frequently will tell you some story where they didn't feel like they're being listened to.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've also been on the other side of that, though, where someone is under the auspices of quote unquote questions. What they're really doing is ranting. I've just got some questions, meaning I really want to tell you how you're wrong about everything. And then it can be hard over the years to listen, because you do be, I've heard this before. I know the phase this person's going through.
Yeah.
I'm very well aware of the type of background and the misconceptions and law and grace and all this stuff. And yet even that is not an escape from the humanizing tendency to listen to people. And of course, you see Jesus, who would always, what does Spufford always say? He said, he treated each person he interacted with as though they were the only person around. And
Total
I think
attention.
there's a sort of a one-on-one aspect to who Christ was that I can't be, but I also know that I've experienced it sometimes. And when you've experienced within the context of a spiritual or church relationship, then it can be truly healing.
Powerful.
Well, let's move on to the second piece, which is related. It's by Dan Brooks. He was writing in the outline, and the title is "Raising a Person in a Culture Full of Types." Here we go. I don't know if you've checked in on tween culture lately, but it is roughly divided into two parts: incredibly boring rap songs about anti-anxiety medication and short internet videos about types of people. I have no quarrel with the first part, but the second part is messing up how my kid thinks. Online discourse is presently shaped by what I call type of guy theory. Its project is to name a series of essential identities that express themselves in certain behaviors. Speaking to the manager, reading David Foster Wallace, breaking up with someone who writes for The Cut, but are not limited to these acts. The bedrock assumption of type of guy theory is that identity exists independently from behavior. You are a type first, and you behave accordingly. This idea that who you are abides somehow outside of what you do is the defining fantasy of our culture, and it appeals particularly to children. The world of the middle schooler is a world of types. My son talks incessantly about VSCO girls and Karens and other categories of people he has learned about from YouTube. He described a classmate as, quote, the kind of person who borrows your pencil and doesn't give it back, i.e., she borrowed his pencil and didn't give it back. Readers of the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre will recognize here a formulation of his classic argument that existence precedes essence. Examples being a soldier who deserts from war. People say he deserted because he's a coward, but really he's a coward because he deserted. This admittedly fine point is not just a matter of language. It also carries an ethical implication. The coward can't really be blamed for doing cowardly stuff because that's his nature. The same way you can't blame the kitchen table for being hard and heavy when you stub your toe. The illusion of a fixed nature gives us an excuse to repeat bad behavior. On the other hand, freedom is scary because nothing is more frightening than the feeling that you are about to change into something else. And then he speaks for himself as someone who said he's the type of person who never wanted kids, and the type of person who didn't think of himself as someone who would make a good father. And then, lo and behold, here he is years later raising a child who's dealing with these things and loving being a dad, but also struggling with it. Now, I don't want to. This is not an article I think to swallow in any sense wholesale. There's a bunch of caveats and qualifications I have as someone who has what we call a low anthropology, but I did think it was interesting in a world of Myers-Briggs and especially the Enneagram and types, shorthand for other people.
Brace yourself.
Putting them into categories that allow you to judge them and to sort of be done with them, especially oneself. Now, I'll just speak editorially as a Christian. I think you can be a type of person that does something wrong and still it not somehow excuse it. Like I think that just because you're not in charge of something doesn't mean you're not culpable for it. However, I want to hear from you guys about this whole thing because we talk about this. It's RJ's Florida man. Sarah, you've got fabulous hair today.
Thank you.
But. And you're Enneagram 3. We all know it.
Enneagram 3. I just keep thinking about how I have this one black friend named Karen, and this has been a tough season for her.
What is a Karen? What is a Karen?
A Karen's and she's also too young to be a Karen.
And God
right?
help you if you're a boomer.
50. But if you're so she's Gen X, but if you're 65, I mean, all white women, 65 years old what are their names? Susan, Karen, Deborah,
Nancy,
Debbie, Nancy. You know
Deborah.
what I mean? So it's a Karen.
Okay.
I come from a Deborah.
Okay.
Her best friend was a Deborah. It was the only name they knew in the Delta. I don't know. I don't know. This piece it's very funny. Dave did not read the parts of the expletives, but I was a big fan of the expletive
He's
parts.
funny. This article is not for the faint of heart. But yeah, amazing.
Talk. I was oh my God. But I was a little this just felt a little catastrophizing to me. I don't know. When I was a teenager, when I was in middle school, I was well, I'm definitely more, my so-called life than clueless. Do you know what I mean? I definitely had,
shorthand.
I think part of this is young people figuring out identities for themselves and those things, either coming together or falling apart. I think we all did that as young people. So, and maybe it's more public and more set in stone because these things are, written down on the internet, but I don't know. It didn't kind of affect me as being as dramatic as he was making it to be. I don't know. But I'm just a Susan.
just a Susan.
That's
Gosh,
what
you,
a Susan would say.
That's what a Susan would think.
Well, Dave, just to call out the caveats, right? The problem we have with this are these kind of Aristotelian categories that say you are what you do, right? And we as
Right.
Christians don't believe that. We believe what Jesus says, out of the heart proceeds all the sin. It's not what goes into a man, it's what comes out of a man that makes him
Yes.
unclean. And yet
We
there's-
disagree with what Brooks is saying on a
That's
fundamental
right.
level.
That's exactly. But there is some mercy in what he's saying as well. And as someone who has ministered for quite a while to middle school kids, this actually makes sense to me because the beauty of middle schoolers is that they almost perfectly reflect whatever is going on in the pop culture at that moment. Whereas high schoolers have a little more. They're more suspicious, a little more reflexivity. They're also maybe a little ashamed of what they actually like, so they're hidden. Whereas middle schoolers, to me, were always a bit more open and transparent. But of course, you're right. It is all about identity and our culture's obsession with identity. But we as Christians, I was thinking about, there's only one identity of a human being from a Christian perspective, and that is a sinner. You're just a sinner. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Nancy or a Karen or a Susan or the type of person who takes the pencil and doesn't give it back. You're a sinner, and that's uncomfortable, right? Because you want to differentiate yourself from everybody else, and you want to sort of understand, stake your claim in the universe or something. I always come back to that scene in Ratatouille at the very end where he has his breakthrough, and he's like, I'm a chef. I'm a chef. And that's supposed to be this cathartic moment. But like, well, you think you're a chef until you get your first bad review. Like, Dave, you think you're a writer until your next book bombs. Like, I think I'm a priest until things just don't really work, stop working out for whatever reason.
Florida man, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But so everyone is just a sinner, which puts you in the same boat as everybody else. But then the flip side of that is you're also you're loved, right? You're a sinner who's loved, and so it doesn't matter what you think you are or what you want to be or what you ought to be or whatever. You are loved and saved, which then gives you the freedom to just live your life, right? To just go out and do what you have to do. And not worry about what you should do because of the kind of person you think you are or think you ought to be. And I mean, you don't have to put other people in a box either. You can sort of let them be what they are. In a way, what you're saying is that this sort of typology, this over typologization, which can be very interesting and very helpful up to a point, is a way of writing the script for yourself in a way that is sometimes doesn't jive with what you're actually like. Oh, introverts are like this, extroverts are like that, and ultimately, you're RJ. And we had to read in the Sermon on the Mount. We had the lectionary passage was Jesus really conflating, motive and action in such a way that really. When it came to adultery is the same thing as lust, and anger is the same thing as murder, and all of a sudden it's a leveling of identity. It's and a sort of the law accuses sort of wholesale the human race, but also puts us all into that category of sinner, which of course later we find out I've come not to call the righteous but sinners. Like that's the good category. That's the category that God is interested in. And yet, the other thing I thought about this is an article that was somewhat recently. This is a natural expression of algorithm kind of thinking, where everything being data streamed and vector plotted and moneyballed, we start to relate to one another not as physical objects or subjects, but as types. We are speaking algorithmically about other human beings rather than subjectively. And at this point, it's really starting to show itself in all sorts of ways. And it fits so neatly into the current political climate too, right? Where depending on whatever political candidate you support, that just says everything about you. Then like, okay, I never need to talk to you again because I know everything about you based on who you voted for or who you're thinking about voting for, and that's just it's so unhelpful on so many levels.
The story that I keep talking around is that. Like last week, we had a really rough morning, and for my fault as well as my eldest child's fault. And he was getting out of the car, and he's like in the car drawing a picture on the way to school, which is only like a minute and a half from our house. And the weather's terrible, and like I'm not looking to kill somebody with my car, so he's like, "Look at my picture! Look at my picture!" And I'm like, "I can't look at your picture. Like I have to get to school." And then like we like pull up, and he's like, "You don't even like my picture," and like I haven't seen his picture yet. And I think my gut response was just to like be like, he's gonna have a terrible day. He's gonna be the kid that yells in the morning and has a terrible day. So I roll down the window. So he's like literally yelling at me through the window, "You don't even like my picture!" And I roll down the window and I'm like, "You're such a good boy. I hope you don't take this into your classroom today." And then he just like calmly looks at me and he goes, "Yes, ma'am. See you later." I was like, he just needed this. Do you know what I mean? Like I don't know if he needed the typology like fragmented or he just needed a new set. But I think there is this element of like, how do we, I mean, it goes so beautifully with the idea of listening, but like, and I love the curiosity thing, RJ. Like, how are we curious about each other? How do we kind of break through these barriers that we put up that, yes, that keep us from avoiding the painful truth that we're all sinners and we're all the same in so many ways, but also like, you know, just to be surprised. I don't know.
Wasn't that, remember what Leslie Jameson quotes that comedian? We talked about it a little while ago, but that a miracle is the universe letting you know it can still surprise you.
Yeah.
And I would say God, you know, letting, you know, that surprises, and that as adults, we sort of switch ourselves off to surprises for the sake
100%.
of convenience and just getting things done. But
and just to name it too, I think it's fair to say that to the degree that we all think of ourselves as a certain type of person, it's probably not positive, and it's probably as a result of something hurtful that someone we love or who loved us said to us in the past, you know, that we carry with us, that we think sort of defines who we are, and to let those voices go.
I could not agree
you
more
know,
with you.
and to
I think that's absolutely true.
to hear God say, well, and there's two things, right? Well, like, yeah, maybe that's true. Maybe who knows? But you know what? I love you. And I'm going to use you, and I don't care, and I'm with you. And like, Dave, I love what you said. Like, yes, you're a sinner, and guess what? Jesus came for sinners. Jesus is the friend of sinners. And so the moment that you embrace that as being your sort of human identity, Christianly speaking, it's like immediately God is on your side, and there's nothing you can do about it.
because his definitely concern behind it is thinking that that his son and his son's friends typecast one another in ways that are negative, as you're a bad person and you're always going to do bad things.
Yes.
And there's a fatalism and a judgment of other people, especially, and of oneself that are, and there's so much hope in the Christian message that can acknowledge the fact that you're not a sinner because you sin, but you sin because you're a sinner, and that also is not the final word about you either. You know, that's God has something more in store, and the Holy Spirit transforms you into something that sometimes you're a stranger to yourself, and the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. And isn't that incredible? CJ linked to an article in last weekend's Weekender about a family a woman whose kids had gotten killed in a drunk driving accident, and they were the writer is in New Zealand, and the writer was talking about grace being the only hope for people who I don't know how exactly I'm connecting this, but it was one of these moments of a woman almost being surprised by her response to the worst thing that's ever happened to her, and it was a Holy Spirit type thing being played out on a national stage. Now, we've talked a lot about families in this episode. We wrote a family issue for the Mockingbird magazine, and I thought we're just going to jump into it. David Brooks wrote a mammoth article for the Atlantic Monthly called "The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake." The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake. And it's tracing, I think it sounds like seeds for a new book of his, but he writes about how once families gathered around the television, now each person has their own screen. There's been a decentralization that's happened among families. It's the story of our times, of once a dense cluster of many siblings and extended kin has fragmented into ever smaller, more fragile forms. He then goes on to say that a certain family ideal has become engraved in our minds of a married couple with 2.5 kids. We think of the American family, many of us still revert to this ideal. We take it as a norm, even though this wasn't the way most humans lived during the tens of thousands of years before 1950, and it isn't the way most humans have lived in the 55 years since 1965. Today, only a minority of American households are traditional two-parent nuclear families, and only 1/3 of American individuals live in this kind of family. From 1970 to 2012, the share of households consisting of married couples with kids has been cut in half. this is what he says. When you put everything together, we're likely living through the most rapid change in family structure in human history. The causes are economic, cultural, and institutional all at once. People who grow up in a nuclear family tend to have a more individualistic mindset than people who grow up in a multi-generational extended clan. People with an individualistic mindset then tend to be less willing to sacrifice self for the sake of family, and the result is more family disruption. People who grow up in disrupted families have more trouble getting the education they need to have a prosperous career, and people who don't have prosperous careers have trouble building stable families because of the financial challenges and other stressors, and the children in those families become more isolated and more traumatized. Our culture is oddly stuck, it would appear. We want stability and rootedness, but also mobility, dynamic capitalism, and the liberty to adopt the lifestyle we choose. We want close families, but not the legal, cultural, and sociological constraints that made them possible. I often ask African friends who have immigrated to America what most struck them when they arrived. Their answer is always a variation on the theme of the loneliness. It's the empty suburban street in the middle of the day, maybe with a lone mother pushing a baby carriage on the sidewalk, but nobody else around.
Yeesh.
A lot more in this article, and he is very careful to note that in recent years, because of financial pressures, you see more, you see the in-law suite as part of the home, where the in-laws come and live, and you have the millennial suite, where the kids live in the basement now, and extended families kind of coming back into vogue because of economic issues. And yet,
but I mean, they're all pissed about it, but yes.
Yeah, he's upset. This article rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. It rubbed both conservatives and liberals the wrong way. I mean, he says
That's
it's
good for him.
Good, Dave.
That's exactly good for him.
No, I mean, he does say that it's we discuss the problems confronting the country, but we don't talk about family enough because it feels too judgmental, too uncomfortable, maybe even too religious. But the blunt fact is that the nuclear family has been crumbling in slow motion for decades, and many of our other problems with education, mental health, addiction, the quality of the labor force stem from that crumbling.
There is so much that could be said. I mean, there's just absolutely no question that our culture has prioritized economics over relationships. The most important thing is to go out and make your way and get yours and have your individuality. And at the same time, like my father, who grew up in Holland as one of 7 children, Catholic family, and was the only one who left Holland, but was a very curious young man. And he told me one time that his father told him, don't read books, it'll make you want things, and it did. It did. He came to the States and I don't know, I look at my family, I love my brothers and I love spending time with them, and we're just like strewn all over the country. And I look at these families in Houston and elsewhere where you have sort of, vaguely multi-generational existences because people all live in close proximity to one another. And it's kind of amazing and foreign to me, and yet also a little bit scary, because it's like you don't want people sort of up in your business at that level. And then I think about the television we watch, the most popular television shows is always about families or pseudo families. Going back to like Cheers, where like the bar was a family, or The Office was a family, or Friends was a family, Seinfeld, Modern Family, all of these. So it's so clear we have this hunger for belonging and connectedness, but we satisfy that through living vicariously through these fictional, television characters, rather than having it ourselves. And then, what he says about chosen families, I'm glad he's optimistic, but when push comes to shove, they're just not the same. It's much easier to just kind of leave it behind, I think, than someone you're actually blood related to. I don't know if you guys agree with that, but you just got a frowny face on your face, Sarah. Like, I mean,
we very clearly we have chosen family grandparents for our children from the church.
Yeah.
And so I think if there has been a loss there, if there's been a major disruption there, and you don't have family in that way, it's kind of all you've got. So I hear you, it's not the same. But it's like when people are willing to
Do that.
take on that mantle.
Absolutely.
When they're willing to go sleep on the floor at Moody Gardens for a Boy Scout camp out with your third grader. I can't even talk about it.
Oh my gosh.
Like, so that he feels like he's a grandfather. Like, there is something about that for me that, like, I know it's not the same, but like, it's such a gift anyway,
And maybe I've never had that, Sarah. I don't know. Many people who, that's incredible.
Well, I think the church at its best can be this, but
That's
you
right.
also always get nervous because there was a church as community and this buzzword that was usually people just wanting the church to be their family. And on the one hand, you want to say, well, that's because they don't have a family or their family's been a source of a pain, but then you also know that a church can't really be a mom and dad and a brother and a sister in the same way. And while it's better than nothing, as you when you certainly find really like kind of proxy aunts and uncles and stuff like that, I think that's beautiful. And we really have lost something by not having these extended families. The church, it's not first and foremost to be a replacement for your family outside of the fact that you're adopted into God's family. I'm also struck, one thing he says in there, which I found to be deeply true, is that he says that nations where a fifth of the people live alone, like Denmark and Finland, are a lot richer than the nations where almost no one lives alone, like the ones in Latin America or Africa. He says that it seems that the market wants us to live alone or with just a few people. That way we are mobile, unattached, and uncommitted, and able to devote an enormous number of hours to our job so we can be more productive. And second, when people who are raised in developed countries get money, they buy privacy, and they buy loneliness.
Yes.
It's really what they buy.
Yes.
The amount of times I've watched people climbing up the ladder in our particular context, they move out of a neighborhood where there are close houses around onto estates where they, not always, but it's a very common narrative to watch people then go out there and their marriages to fall apart. And they come back, gosh, I didn't really realize how much it meant to be closer to people and to have neighbors who could just keep me sane and not just staring at my light fixtures or something.
That's such the vision of hell from The Great Divorce. C.S. Lewis's book, where hell, where everyone gets exactly what they want, but they keep on moving farther and farther away from each other because they just can't stand to be around each other.
Yeah.
And there is something sort of good actually about forced intimacy and having to rub shoulders with people that are different than you and learning to actually deal with conflict and but also just have the joy of relationships, but it's sad when those momentary difficulties trump all of the benefits that come with being in a relationship with someone else.
I mean, I do think this fits somewhat into like what we were talking about earlier. It's funny, these narratives we have about ourselves. Like, I'm not the kind of person who, I mean,
who wants a big family. I like a small family.
Yeah. I mean, I think about just my relationship with communities of women and how I've often been in communities where I felt like I didn't quite click, certainly like when I was in high school and was obviously like this, like I am right now, only in Mississippi. And, people would say things to me like, why are you always quoting Time Magazine? And it was like, because I guess we're the only house in the neighborhood that gets, I don't know, it's not that highfalutin, but my parents get magazines, it's like, and then being at Ole Miss and, so many people pledged Greek and I didn't. And it was really hard to find community. I mean, I did, but it was hard. And then we were in New York, which was its own sort of struggle just because we were in these, especially this really upper echelon small town. And I remember, this is like just me venting. So sorry, this is the venting portion of the podcast, but I was trying to relate to this mom who's in our house and we're talking about cleaning. And I was like, I can't stay on top of it. She's like, I just let it go. I just don't worry about it. She's like, I just hire a cleaning lady. And I was like, we can't do that. And now we're here. We're also in a rectory, which means like we don't own our house. The church does. And it's also it's in an area where a lot of moms don't work. Right. And there's, the houses are constantly kind of being redone on the inside, which is really fascinating because that's not a thing. I don't know if the church will ever do that to this house. I don't know, it's a thing where like, do I tell myself, well, I'm not the kind of person who's in relationship with the communities God's put me in? Do I label myself that way? I mean, I know people who do. I have before. But what's the loss there? It's massive. It's a massive loss. Like, I feel like I can't count on these women in my neighborhood, and I'm not going to let them think that they can count on me. You know what I mean? Like, what does that say? What does that mean for me? So, I don't know. I thought about that in reading this, because I do live in a community that really, there are kids always out in the street, and it is this beautiful place. And like, how do I step into that as, someone who's, brings my so-called life narrative to a clueless community? You know what I mean?
Enneagram 3. Well, I don't know what to say. I always think of Woody Allen's film Radio Days, about his growing up in Brooklyn in this huge family, this huge Jewish family with all these characters and everyone fighting constantly but loving, and you are taken care of in a way. And I don't think that's necessarily means that to poo-poo the nuclear family. My nuclear family is, been so much life for me. It's not like the extended family denies the nuclear family. It's in there. And that would be, I remember my wife's family, they all moved onto the same street for a little while, and it's because there was one marriage that had fallen apart and they kind of needed help raising kids. And among that sort of echelon of that kind of the prep school world where they were, no one was making decisions based upon proximity to loved ones in that way. You were really more making
proximity towards loved ones' pain, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's incredible.
And it ended up shaping her values and everything, but also it provided a rich kind of living experience. So, talking of communities, we're going to end here by talking about Ben Madison. Our own Ben Madison has written an article called I Really Want to Skip Church. I really want to skip church. And he writes, I'm constantly trying to get out of church on Sunday mornings, which would probably be fine if I wasn't a pastor. Then he references there's an article that had been making the rounds in his discussion among his sort of professional Christian friends about the centrality of Sunday worship. That the writer basically says that Sunday morning worship should not be optional, and it should be your excuse for getting out of everything else, rather than vice versa. And I admit to feeling that I need to be in church. I need God's grace, mercy, and presence in my life constantly. Things get worse when it's not there. I need to gather with others, need to hear the gospel, need to be a part of this ragtag, imperfect, messy body and family we call church. I need to be reminded that Christ died for my sins and saved me from myself. I know that I need church. I know that I should want to go to church. But I can't help but feel this article gets one huge thing wrong, which is church is hard. It's hard for a lot of reasons: work schedules, young families, calendar conflicts, personal conflicts, trauma, history, bad sermons that leave you more exhausted than when you came in. It's just not as tasty as the endless mimosa brunch. It requires more conversation than hot yoga. Church is hard because it's the wild card in the God-people relationship. It's hard because life and people and relationships and just existing are hard. Church is hard because of the exact same reason it is good: the people who are there. So as much as I'd love to tell people church should be your excuse for missing everything else, I'm acutely aware of two things: that church might be the reason you are missing love, grace, and mercy in your life, and two, church might be a lot more work than you can handle at the moment. I'll get to his ending, but before I do, what do you think is of Ben's opening here?
I saw the same article floating around that Ben's referencing, and he's so gracious, because I saw all these people posting it, and I was like, job security, it's like all these clergy are like, you should prioritize church. So I was so grateful for this response, because it really astonishes me how people, and this is going to sound like an ageist thing, and I apologize, maybe it's just a gendered thing. We can just blame all men, and especially all men over 50. That'll be our title for this episode.
That type.
Yeah. I think they honest to God forget how hard it is to get to church. I think the worst thing is that clergy especially have never had to get to church, right? Like in the same way. They've never had to get a family to church. They've never had to have these hard conversations. Like they're there, they're paid, it's great. And so I really appreciated that Ben, especially as a guy, and especially as someone who's ordained, wrote this because for me, the real danger in us forgetting how hard it is for people to get there is honestly the way that we preach the gospel. Because I think that people put this effort into getting there, and then they get there, and what they hear is bad news for their weary hearts. What they get there and hear is that, they may have made it here, but gosh, there's more work to do later. Or they may have heard it here. My least favorite sermon, and I would just like everyone who preaches regularly to write this down, is when people preach about the people who are not there. That's like the worst sermon. And the thing is, like, I used to think that was just in my waning mainline denominational context. They say that in non-denom churches all the time. Like I have a friend who literally had to stop going to like one of those big, happy, non-denominational churches because she's like, every time we got there, they talked about who wasn't there. And she's like, we're here. We need to hear something, So I think for me, I know Ben wasn't talking exactly about preaching, but I think for clergy who listen to this, it's really important to read his piece in light of our preaching.
Yeah.
I can completely relate to what Ben is saying about the sun going down on Saturday night and your blood pressure rising a little bit and you getting a little bit more irritable. There was one year when Valentine's Day fell on Saturday night and we went out to dinner. It was not a great dinner. Jamie was like, yeah, we probably shouldn't do this again on Valentine's Day. If it falls on a Saturday, we'll find a different night to do it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, Sunday morning can be stressful as a clergy person too. I mean, as he says, and your word, how are things going to go? Who's going to show up? How's my sermon gonna go? But Sarah, I just love what you said about remembering how hard it is to get there, and I've tried to say that on Sunday mornings, especially when I've been presiding over a family service, and which I sometimes we had a family service at a church where I served, and I called it church for people who could barely make it to church. And I had a seminary professor who talked about, he said, when you look out in the congregation, just remember that a lot of people have walked over broken glass to get there, and to treat them like sufferers. So. To bring good news. Sorry, Sarah, what were you going to say?
No. I do think it's important also to acknowledge that it's more than just families, which I think Ben does a really good job of. But I know so many middle-aged, boomer-aged people who just can't do it anymore. Do you know what I mean? Because they went to church for decades. They drugged their kids there. They were made to feel like church was this giant. It was like the Hindenburg, and they were up there just slapping on patches, I'll cover Sunday school and then crawling underneath, and I'll do altar guild, and their kids leave the house and they're I cannot do it anymore, know?
Yeah, and I'll make a confession. He talked about going to church when he's on vacation. I don't ever go to church on vacation. I don't, and there's part of me, and maybe this was the part of the. Well, I guess he was raised in New Jersey. I was raised in Connecticut and New York. I'm still kind of amazed that anyone shows up to church on Sunday. I'm just so thankful. I'm just really? You decided to get up this morning and come here when you could have slept in and he says, had a mimosa and read the New York Times and just I'm amazed that anyone I'm just so thankful and amazed that these wonderful people show up at church on Sunday. So I totally related to that.
I was fascinated by that as well because we always sort of have that quandary for vacation. And, we're about to do sabbatical this summer. Mm-hmm. And what Ben describes is you are smart to not go to church because what he describes is exactly what happens. You just sit there and you're man, that sermon was shitty. It's just judgment the whole time.
I forget what day it is. There's been a few times when we're on a road trip on vacation, we could really use some Chick-fil-A. And we show up to Chick-fil-A, we're why is it closed? What's going? Oh my gosh, it's Sunday. It's I don't even know what day of the week it is. And I will say,
Chick-fil-A forsaking
and
clergy on vacation.
And to speak to your point about people who can't do church anymore, I've met a couple different people since I got to West Palm who did exactly that, who took a break from church for about 10 years.
Yeah.
But usually it was either the result of a real significant trauma they experienced at church where they're just like, I can't do this anymore. Or one woman told me, she's like, I went to church forever and then I just got tired of every single week being told what I wasn't doing and to work harder, try more, do more. And I just couldn't do it. So I stopped going for 10 years. But now that those people are back and it's kind of a joy, I think for them and for me to have them back.
My conundrum is always when you preach the gospel and you preach, I think, the grace of God and the forgiveness of sins. Sometimes people are like, okay, I get it. Now I want to sort of sleep in on Sunday mornings. And I have seen that happen, and I think that the challenge, at least from my rector here, Paul Walker, is always like, no matter when someone comes, like whenever they make excuses about how they haven't been there for a while, people are always so self-conscious about that. You just it's a Mr. Magoo situation. I think that's how my father even put it. It's just sort of you're not, even if you are keeping score in your head, you just can pretend that you're not, and it's great. I mean, as Ben says, it's a terrible business model to treat people the same whether they come twice a week or twice a year. It's not a good business model. And yet that's also something beautiful, because I'm around people who tell me that they would miss anything, but they won't miss church because it's the aroma of life. It's the juice of life. And everywhere else they go, they hear that they're not enough and that they just need to be more and work harder, and that they're holding on for dear life for Sunday. And I know that it can be a seasonal thing. The amount of times where I thought someone has stopped coming to church because of something we did or something we said, and then it just turns out to have been a circumstantial thing where a baby wasn't sleeping, or an in-law was, developing Alzheimer's or something like that, and then they come back. And if you come in with this sort of, you need to prioritize getting to church, I mean, I think that kind of law will push them away. Well, the temptation as people stop going to church, or they're able to go to church less, or they're just so freaking overwhelmed that it's as with parents of small kids, it's the most they can do to get there every once in a while. I mean, the temptation is to shout from the rooftops, is to write things as like, church should be your excuse for missing everything else, is to yell, just go to church, damn it, blah, 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 that church sign that says blah, 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 just go to church. And I think that's unfortunately, as tempting as that is, it's the same thing with my kid, just talk faster,
Right. It's 100. Yeah.
And I mean, even if I have a good friend who says, what's the only key to marriage I can find out is to keep going to church and keep having sex. Like that's the.
But like the subtext,
wisdom.
I mean, I think that's really brilliant, Dave, because I think the subtext to that is, when we yell at people like, you need to prioritize church over everything else, what we're saying is it's sad. You're just not the kind of person that goes to church.
You're not the kind.
I
never thought of.
You're not the
I want
kind.
to. I mean, we have I feel like I constantly run into people's like, I never really thought of myself as a churchgoer, and here I am, and I don't really understand, but I never.
We limit, right? We limit when we say things like that.
Like when if you're in a church that is on Christmas or Easter says, well, welcome to everyone who's never shown up the rest of the year. Run, or at least pray for your own heart, and especially for the preacher, because that's a resentful statement, and it's probably the result of enormous wells of rage that are just coming to the surface. And Ben says, I think I'll close with him. He says the answer to encouraging folks, to discover for themselves the benefits of corporate worship is not to shame them, burden them, or fact them to death. The answer is the only one we can really give, because the answer, it really isn't about us, but what God does through and for and in and around us. The answer is about God acting first. This is not a satisfying answer. It's not satisfying because we don't get to feel righteous for being there, and we don't get to judge others for not being there. It's not satisfying because it sees people as they are, not as they could or should be. As messy, busy, stressed out, over-anxious, over-scheduled, tired, lonely, beloved children of God. It's not satisfying because it forces us to remember that God loves us even before we loved God or showed up at church. It forces us to provide an actual accounting of just how much we don't love God and just how much God loves us anyway. This answer, I'm sorry to say, does not make me any less eager to skip church on Sunday morning, but it does remind me that God loves me in church and out of church. And so if you do, by the unmerited, unsurpassable, incomprehensible grace of God, make it out of bed on Sunday morning with enough time to make it to church 20 minutes late after getting the kids dressed and fed, the dogs watered and walked, the family out the door, we'll be glad to see you, especially if you're the pastor.
So good.
Well, thank you guys for listening. Lots of ground to cover, but I hope to.
I'll look forward to hearing what you said when I listen back to the podcast.
Amen. All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Remember, you can find us on the web at www.mbird.com. And we'd always love to hear from you at info@mbird.com. Audio production for the Mockingcast is provided by the Narrativo Group, and if you like what you've heard, please do drop over to iTunes and leave us a rating and review. Until next time.
Praise the Lord.